Welcome to Science and Wisdom Live, where scientists and meditators meet.
So, Paul Howard, it's really a pleasure to have a chance to talk to you today. I loved your film, Infinite Potential, and I've had a chance to watch you and a number of other incredible luminaries talking about the film and the various discussions you had afterwards. So it's a privilege to talk to you today, and I'm excited for it. Thanks for joining us.
Well, excited to talk to you too, Scott. And I'm never tired about talking about the movie Infinite Potential or David Bohm. In fact, this is something that's going to go on and will consume me, I think, for the rest of my life, because his ideas are very far-reaching, and I've got a set of new projects now coming up that will extend these ideas into new projects.
That's really wonderful, because it seems like his work was ignored a bit during his lifetime, and certainly maybe not understood either.
Absolutely, yeah.
So maybe that's a good place to start. Your last film is called Infinite Potential and explores the life and ideas of David Bohm. Could you tell us a little bit when you came to know about Bohm and how you first became interested in his work?
Okay, well, it's a very good question, Scott, because I grew up in a family, kind of a large family in Ireland, and my father was very interested in science, and he was also very interested in wider spirituality. I mean, I grew up as a Catholic in a Catholic family, not a very strict Catholic family. We were very much tuned into the ways of the world, so to speak. But my father was very interested in science and I suppose philosophy and so on. And, we had a lot of roundtable discussions, the family, about science, spirituality, and the name Einstein would come up a lot. The name Niels Bohr would come up a lot. The name Stephen Hawking would come up a lot. And it amazes me now in hindsight that the name David Bohm never appeared anywhere. It was just like extraordinary. And so really, I have to, in order to answer your question, I have to fast forward many years to relatively recent history. And it was when I had a very accidental meeting with an individual in a cafe bar in a small remote village in Tuscany in Italy. And I wandered into that cafe bar. I mean, I say now that it was a kind of an accidental meeting. There was nothing planned about it. But in hindsight, I think I was being pushed into that cafe bar by perhaps unknown forces. Maybe the quantum potential was pushing me there. But anyway, I went in there and it looked deserted. There was only one other individual in that cafe bar. And he heard me ordering an espresso and obviously detected that my native language wasn't Italian. And he introduced himself. And he introduced himself as David Peat, who was a quantum physicist and an associate of David Bohm. Now, of course, I didn't know that at that time. And I was very curious about him because he had a very strong Liverpudlian accent, hail from Liverpool. And he was a good bit older than me. And I kind of looked at him and I said, because I was a great Beatles fan, and I said to him, were you a contemporary of John Lennon and Paul McCartney? And he said, well, actually, he said, my father was a electrical contractor, and he had an apprentice, an electrical apprentice, trainee electrician by the name of George Harrison. so apparently this young apprentice electrician by the name of George Harrison came in one day and told David Peat's father that he was leaving to join a band called the Beatles. and David Peat's father said to him, he said, well, please don't come back looking for your job because it won't be there. And of course, the rest is history. So anyway, that was David Peat. And over a period of time then, that was our first meeting. Over a period of time then, I had a few more meetings with David Peat, and he told me that he was a quantum physicist, and he seemed to be very focused on this individual called David Bohm. And he was actually running some international conferences in this small little village based around the ideas of David Bohm. Because the other thing that struck me that I was fascinated by, when I'd go up to that little village in the evening, and there were people there from all over the world, you know, Australians, Asians, Americans, British people, and so on. And I was just wondering, what is the big attraction here? And apparently, they were coming to David Peat's conferences on David Bohm. So anyway, over a period of time, when David Peat found out I was a filmmaker, he asked me to read a few pages about David Bohm that he had written. Now, he'd already written a book called Infinite Potential, the life and times of David Bohm, as opposed to the life and ideas of David Bohm. But anyway, I read these few pages, and I was absolutely initially struck, not so much by the physics, because I'm not a physicist and I didn't understand the physics in any great depth at that stage, except at a very basic level. But what really struck me was the philosophical aspects of David Bohm, philosophical straying into the spiritual. But what I was most impressed by was that the ideas, and in a sense, what really struck me was the philosophical implications of consciousness in quantum physics. That's really what I read in these few pages. So that was kind of straying into the spiritual. But what I was most impressed by was that it wasn't just some kind of New Age speak or New Age talk. This was something that was very firmly grounded in hard physics. And that's really what gave it substance, if you like, for me when I read this. And then, of course, just the general facts of his life, the fact that he was intimate with Einstein and Oppenheimer and all of these big names in science, and suffered rejection and then found himself again. All of these things I just thought would make a great story surrounding the core ideas, if you like, of consciousness and the groundbreaking work that he did in physics.
Can you talk specifically what that connection is, or that you saw, or David Bohm talks about, between consciousness and quantum physics?
Well, when you actually delve into David Bohm, what he gives you is a sense of the underlying reality out of which our manifest reality emerges. Okay. And I must say, ever since I was very young, I had a very deep sort of intuition that there was something more going on to the reality that we experience every day. So I think that David Bohm's ideas, he wrote a wonderful book called Wholeness and the Implicate Order. And he describes this deeper order, this enfolded order, out of which manifest reality becomes explicate or unfolds into the reality that we experience every day. Now, right there's something very interesting going on, because he talks about enfolding and unfolding. And, you know, I've always seen things visually. And of course, one of the great challenges of making this Bohm or this film about David Bohm was to be able to visualize some very difficult concepts. But, you know, I always saw this idea of unfolding. I mean, if you can imagine yourself standing in an ocean, say on a beach, but you go into the ocean, and your back is to the breaking waves, and you see the waves breaking, unfolding up on the beach, and then you see how they gather themselves up again. They're becoming enfolded before they unfold again. So we used a lot of imagery in the film to express these kind of ideas, but the idea of an underlying reality, and of course that reality ultimately, when we drill down into it, is the quantum reality. And in the quantum world, of course, relative space doesn't exist, linear time doesn't exist, but yet out of this abstract, say, quantum space, we get linear time, and we get spatial relationships and so on. So in a sense, this touched for me the kind of mystery of creation, that this is actually how creation happens. And that to me was fundamental in terms of making a connection to a kind of explaining what I suppose mystical traditions and the tradition I grew up in and so on about the creation of the world and our place within it. And I would just add to that Bohm gives us a very great sense as to how our sensory perceptions misperceive manifest reality. And I had a lot of very direct experiences of that growing up, but never understood them completely until I read David Bohm. And so that's how I kind of got sucked into all of this.
So when you talk about wholeness and David Bohm's ideas about an underlying reality, is that something that is more of a mystical, like personally felt experience, or is it something that's connected, like specifically and through mathematics to the science of quantum physics, or is there a spectrum of his ideas that spans those areas?
I think that the physics gives us a very rational explanation for what's going on, so that what we feel intuitively or what we feel even spiritually is grounded in the physics, And I think that, there's an opening scene in the film that I think kind of encapsulates this, where Bohm was out for a walk with a colleague of his, a physicist also, but they were walking under the night sky, and there was this vast array of stars, and Bohm just so happened to look up, and he said, we consider when we look up at the night sky the vast spaces and the emptiness and so on. But he said that there's another way of looking at this, that he didn't see it as vast emptiness at all. He saw it as vast fullness. And even though we don't perceive it through our sensory perceptions as vast fullness, but he explained that is the ground out of which all of creation becomes manifest, and that you, me, and the stars and the planets and the systems that are all out there are just like little bubbles, swimming around on top of this ground out of which we emerge. So, and also when you look at, for example, the Buddhist concept of emptiness. This is something that I was talking to the Dalai Lama about, and of course he had a very special relationship with David Bohm. He regarded David Bohm as his science guru, and even today, actually, I was reading an interview with him recently where he said that he now regards himself as 50% Buddhist monk and 50% scientist.
Yeah, I've heard that. I love that so much.
Yeah. But the the idea that out of emptiness, we get fullness. And this completely cohered, if you like. This is why I think Bohm and His Holiness the Dalai Lama really got on so well. Mm-hmm. And I explored, of course, a lot of this in my interview with the Dalai Lama. But then when I jumped back to my own upbringing, you know, my father very often used to make reference to, in Christianity, to the Bible about, you know, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven is within you. And my father had a very lovely way of explaining that. He said, it's not really a place. It's a new dimension of reality. It's a dimension of reality that is beyond our sensory perception. So growing up, I had these ideas, you know, about these other dimensions of reality. And when I came face to face with Bohm, he was showing me through quantum reality, that other dimension of reality, you know, out of which our manifest world emerges. So that was very, very important. And Bohm makes some beautiful references to the eternal. You know, he talks about the universe as being organic, that the whole universe is invested in each and every part of the universe, right? These are just incredible ideas. And of course, His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote a beautiful book called The Universe in a Single Atom.
Oh yeah, that's a fantastic book.
Which is kind of the same idea. And Bohm speaks of all moments being one, that all of time is invested in each and every passing moment. And I think that you possibly remember in the film, there was a lovely little scene where Bohm as a child was up in the mountains near Wilkes-Barre in Pennsylvania, where he grew up. And Bohm was very awkward socially. You know, he was he couldn't run out and kick a ball on a football pitch, or you know. He was just very awkward socially. He couldn't move with the kind of grace and fluidity of his friends. But you know, he said one of his big aha moments was when he was crossing a stream with his friends, and he could see how easily they could just hop from stone to stone. But Bohm was there kind of almost working it out mathematically. How am I going to do this? You know? And suddenly he just had to let go and hop from stone to stone and go with the movement. And later in life, he talks about how that really was his first, if you like, intuitive moment where he experienced, if you like, the idea of consciousness as continually in a state of emergence, that it's never static, it's never complete, but an unending process of unfolding and enfolding. So the whole idea of movement and emergence is there in Bohm. And what's so beautiful there, and what I loved about Bohm as well, and again, I think this is very spiritual, and it ties in, I think, with the whole idea of enlightenment, which is something that a lot of the Eastern mystical traditions have been immersed in. And you know, I'm sure you're very familiar with all this stuff. But the idea that there is no final theory, there is no theory of everything. Everything is a process. Everything is a kind of journey, and there is no final destination. More of a kind of a place we go where we can see things differently. So it's not so much a place, but a new way of seeing things. And that was, I think, one of the beautiful things that I loved about Bohm, because that's how I feel. He talks about the spirit that infuses all life, all human beings, all life on the planet. And he talks about that spirit as being never born, and never dying. And it ties in beautifully with this whole idea that everything is in a state of emergence. So that from the quantum reality to our manifest reality, everything is in a state of emergence. And he gives us the quantum potential. And in the quantum potential, he explains beautifully, and I have to explain it very much. He explains it in mathematics and formulas. But the quantum potential being a kind of an omnipresent energy field that is informing each and every particle in the universe of its internal condition and context within the whole. And the whole, of course, meaning the whole universe, you, me, and everything, because we're all made up of these tiny little things we call particles. So the quantum potential is, if you like, informing, it is allowing the physical universe to be. And that was a beautiful idea. But there's a beautiful quote, and this gets back to the start of the answer I was giving to your question, that Bohm very much believed in he never really believed in the self-deterministic view. He felt that there was more of a causal view in terms of how a reality emerges and so on. But he talks about how the eternal unfolds in us. And just as the eternal unfolds in us, so too we, through our participation, can influence the eternal as it unfolds back into itself. So that, in other words, if, for example, our moral imperatives are aligned and we're doing good work in the world, it's like the wave breaking on the beach. When it unfolds back into itself, it comes back stronger. And then if we're doing bad in the world, likewise, the wave is coming back, but it's not coming back with any real moral strength, if you like, or taking us, if you like, towards a more enlightened view of reality. And out of, again, the quantum potential, we get this whole idea of non-locality, which really, I suppose, when you bring it down to very simple terms, is all about the profound interconnectedness of everything in the universe, where particles, no matter how far apart, at one end of the universe to the other, somehow are in touch with one another without any signaling passing between them. And of course, this was the great debate when these ideas were first being talked about. How can we have non-locality and relativity? Because Einstein's relativity is all about, matter breaks up at the speed of light. So that there was this great conflict, about relativity, which is all about signaling, from A to B. But non-locality is about communication that is going on all the time between particles at one end of the universe, between you and me, between everything in existence, with no signaling passing between them, which in a sense is a kind of a proof of our interconnectivity. And again, if you apply that in a moral sense, or in a religious sense, or in a spiritual sense, it basically means if I am harming another, I'm harming myself.
Yeah.
If I am doing good to another, I am giving myself a gift in a way, that in a sense, we are all bound by a kind of mutuality, that what I do to one will affect others.
Yeah.
And this, again, not only in terms of us humans, but in terms of how we're treating our planet, how the household we all share. So in a sense, all of the science, if you like, that David Bohm was immersed in, And it's very much my feeling that David Bohm, I see him as a visionary scientist, but I also see him as a spiritual man. I suppose in the same way that the Dalai Lama now sees himself as a 50% Buddhist and 50% scientist. But I think that all of these great ideas about our essential interconnectivity all at the end of the day boil down to the necessity that we respect one another, that we love one another, that we take care of one another, and this is where the idea of undivided wholeness that Bohm gives us, I think, is such a great platform for all of this, and feeds beautifully into mystical traditions. It feeds into Christianity. It feeds into, so I think that this is where you get a kind of the nexus, if you like, between science and spirituality. So that in a sense is, I think, what's so appealing about Bohm, the physicist, Bohm, the scientist, and Bohm, the spiritual man.
Yeah, I like how you describe how a kind of mysticism and morality come out of the scientific basis of interconnectedness, that when you're harming or hurting, you're not only harming someone else. There is no separate other. You're harming other, you harm yourself. Maybe even you harm the whole universe as you do ill in the world.
And I think when you begin to understand that we are the universe, that it's not really the parts that make the whole, it's the whole that is invested in each and every part of the universe. And that's really, I think, what we need to learn, and it's very interesting because I was totally amazed at how successful the film was and still is. And there's going to be another wave now when we release the director's cut. But I think the global pandemic, in a way, helped us in a very interesting kind of way, because we were originally going to release it through, the traditional ways, through traditional television and so on. But when the pandemic happened, one of our distributors came up with the idea and said, no, why don't we just do it all virtually? And we actually put the film out there for a period of 3 months for free. And it was just amazing. We just got south of 1 million views on YouTube in that period. And the demand for it is just incredible. And the director's cut now, as I say, that will kind of, I think, excite another wave of interest. And it will be going on some of the streaming broadcasters in the US. And it'll be available, obviously, through iTunes and Amazon and so on, and available through our own website and so on. But I was just, I couldn't believe the wave of interest in it, because I think people in the pandemic were beginning to realize how vulnerable, in a way, our institutions, our economic, our cultural, our political structures, that suddenly they can be, they can fall apart quite easily. And I think people were thinking perhaps of maybe how could we develop new models? How could we, and I think Bohm, with his groundbreaking ideas in physics, reached out into dimensions beyond physics, into the spiritual. And I think that this is what kind of caused great chords, if you like, to start ringing in people's minds or spirits and so on. But the response has just been tremendous.
It's a good time to think about our place in the universe. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
I remember from the film, there was a part where you talked about David Bohm, a scientific paper that he wrote. He was very excited about putting his ideas into scientific language, submitting it for peer review, and then he got a very disappointing response, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
Why do you think other physicists found it so hard to accept the point of view that he put, even into scientific language?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. You must remember the time that Bohm, you're referring directly to his hidden variables paper, right? And Bohm had started work on that when he was in Princeton. And you remember that there was they were building the atomic bomb at the time, and Bohm was very close to Oppenheimer, and he was of course he was very close to Oppenheimer when he was at Berkeley. He went on to Princeton later. I think it was Wheeler, I think, recommended him, but they could clearly see that he had a kind of a maverick genius that they wanted to explore. So he was greatly accepted in the beginning. But of course, during the whole Los Alamos and the building of the atomic bomb, the Americans were building the bomb, and interestingly enough, the Americans and the Russians were allies fighting the Germans. You know, but still there was this great paranoia about communism that was pervading everything. And, there was this debate going on at the time, should we help the Russians? Should we, because after all, they were our allies during the war and so on. And the situation was that there were suspected leaks coming out of Los Alamos, and that these leaks were getting into the hands of the Russians. And of course, there was, as I say, great paranoia about communism and so on. But very interesting, Robert Oppenheimer himself was very interested in communism, and in fact regarded himself as a communist. Bohm and many others, young physicists at the time, were invited into a group by Oppenheimer that explored communist ideals. And there was this whole idea about, could an individual be free within a collective like communism? And it's very interesting that in Bohm's work in physics, everything he did in physics echoed his wider philosophical views. Like, for example, we go to a lot of lengths in the film. His initial work about plasma and metals, when Bohm was looking at how electrons behave, he found that the electron within the experiment was relatively free within, if you like, the collective of the experiment. So he was kind of thinking that perhaps an individual, a human individual, could be free within a collective like communism. So they were debating all of these ideas among the physicists, and a lot of them, as I say, were very interested in communism. But then when the leaks were suspected from Los Alamos going to the Russians, the American government, they set up the McCarthy inquests. And of course, McCarthy did inquests even into Hollywood, suspected writers in Hollywood who were communists and so on. But because David Bohm was part of the group, that were interested in communism, he was put under the spotlight in the McCarthy inquest, along with many others. Now, of course, eventually he was completely cleared, and I won't go into the details of pleading the fifth or pleading the first and all of that kind of thing. But even though he was cleared of any suspicion of passing leaks over to the Russians or anything like that, the communist trait, if you like, stuck with him. And his peers at Princeton and the authorities at Princeton, because he was involved in the McCarthy inquiries, wanted to keep him at arm's length. And they didn't renew, if you like, his contract. He was an assistant, I think, professor of physics at that time. And Oppenheimer himself, of course, he was untouchable, because he was supervising the whole atomic bomb program. And when the fallout of the McCarthy inquiry, basically after all the deliberations, there was a sense in Oppenheimer that he wanted now to remove himself, even though he was a communist himself, but untouchable as far as the American government were concerned, because he was the supremo at Los Alamos, and he was spearheading the whole atomic bomb program. He had to distance himself from the others who were associated with, even though Bohm was one of his prize students. He had to distance himself. Now, Bohm wrote his famous hidden variables theory, and that theory really changed everything, but it wasn't recognized at the time. But Oppenheimer called a group of the leading physicists at the time to discuss Bohm's paper.
Yeah, you talk about that in the movie.
Yeah, and you know, Oppenheimer put out this now famous statement, right? That if we cannot find fault with Bohm, we must ignore him. We must continue to ignore him, right? And that was all political fallout.
I see.
Political fallout from the whole McCarthy investigation, to such a point also that Bohm was forced into exile. He had to go to Brazil. Yeah. Einstein actually came to his defense, but Oppenheimer wanted him out of the way because of his associations with, and even though he could find nothing wrong with Bohm's paper, he said, you know, we have to ignore him.
I see. Well, so for a minute, I wonder if we could get a tiny bit into details, because I think a lot of people know some of these details, at least in lay terms right now, that there's something called the Copenhagen interpretation that says the probabilistic fields of quantum mechanics collapse when you measure them somehow and turn into a specific measurement. And then there's another interpretation that was considered far out for a long time, but now has many mainstream followers, which is this many worlds hypothesis, right? That as quantum states explain all of these different options, that every single one happens, and that the universe is is forking all the time. Is David Bohm's interpretation of quantum theory in line with one of these two interpretations, or is it a third one?
Well, David Bohm really has his own unique interpretation. His interpretation is closer to many worlds, right? The traditional interpretation was, you know, the double slit experiment, where, you know, the conscious observation, when you bring an observer into an experiment, basically the wave function collapses. And this was something that was a huge mystery in terms of quantum physics. Now, Niels Bohr, of course, was the physicist who, I suppose he's regarded as the supremo of the Copenhagen interpretation, which is the two-slit experiment. But the idea that the wave function collapses when it's observed has been one of the greatest mysteries in quantum physics, and still is a huge mystery in quantum physics to this day. But it depends really on how you view it, right? Niels Bohr was not so interested, and the quantum physicists at the time were not so interested in why, because all they were interested in was the statistical information and the data that they could collect to advance at that time the war effort and work on other things. And every physicist, there's a famous kind of expression, was just told to calculate. Don't mind what's going on underneath. Just you know, we've got plenty of information. We don't need to know how we're getting the information, but we have the information, so let's use it. But Bohm eventually, he kind of ignored the double slit. He knew that there was something much deeper going on within the quantum world. And eventually, Bohm's theory arrives at a point where there is a single wave function that is determining everything. It's not many waves, it's a single wave function. And that single wave function encompasses the whole picture. Right? So that's really where Bohm, in kind of simple terms, arrives at. And we've an animation in the longer version of the film that actually explains that in a lot of detail. So we go through the two slit, we go through the quantum potential, non-locality, but eventually we arrive at this idea where the single wave function, that there is one wave function that is orchestrating everything in the universe. That's really what it is. The many worlds theory is close to that, but off it slightly, but could almost be a sister to that theory in a way, you know, because they are very close. Because once you accept the idea of non-locality and particle entanglement, it's like what's going on here could be mirrored in other places in the universe, you know. So you know, I haven't delved deep into the many worlds theory, but because because Bohm gives me a very coherent explanation of how everything is operating in the universe, that not only sits well with me from a non-physicist point of view, because I would never in any sense tell anybody I was a physicist. It was my job as a filmmaker to try and decode what the physicists were saying and somehow make it accessible to people through the film. But to me, he gives me, and I think he gives, and I think is recognized now, certainly in more recent times within the Western physics community, as giving us the most plausible explanation and most coherent explanation for the nature of reality and how reality works, essentially.
And so what he describes, it's not new or additional math on top of quantum physics. It's a way of interpreting what quantum physics is saying about the universe. Is that right?
That would be correct. He deliberately titled his hidden variables paper. He said that we must always allow for a hidden variable, right? And the hidden variable is something that could well be unreachable by science now or into the future. He left that entirely open. So there was a certain sense that we must have a certain humility in the face of creation, in the face of what's going on there. And of course, this is something that's echoed also in Eastern traditions, you know, that while Eastern traditions have traditionally used mind and wisdom and meditation, you know, Western science uses laboratories and instruments and so on. But ultimately, they both come to the same point. And the same point is, well, what is reality? You know, and I think that Bohm, through his hidden variables paper, gives us a very coherent explanation. It certainly is taking us in a direction, not a final theory by any means, because he never believed there would be. He believed that for every question we ask, we're going to get 1,000 answers. And each of those 1,000 answers is going to raise 1,000,000 new questions. So in other words, there is no end to this. And that's what's beautiful. It's a journey without a destination.
Even some hardcore, you know, atheist scientists that I've heard and read say the same thing in this humility of knowledge, that we replace wrong theories with less wrong theories. You know, there's never the right one at the end. But a question from the scientific perspective is, are Bohm's theories testable, you know, in the way that we look at science today in terms of making falsifiable hypotheses, or are they more interpretations?
No, they're absolutely testable. And right now at the University of Toronto and indeed at UCL in London, there is work going on specifically to prove the the quantum potential. And if the quantum potential is proven, if Bohm's theory is ultimately proven, now the chief scientist there, who actually featured in the documentary, Basil Hiley, he is absolutely 100% confident that they have proven it. But it has to go out, if you like, to the wider physics community for verification.
Yeah, peer
But
review.
of course, yeah. But there's a lot of skeptics, of course, out there. But the maths and the physics are there to prove it. But this work continues in London, and it's also similar work is continuing in Toronto, and it's all based around Bohm's hidden variables view that embodies the quantum potential, that embodies non-locality, and the idea of quantum entanglement and our interconnectivity. So all of these philosophical ideas come out of it, but at a core scientific level, absolutely, it is testable and is being tested.
Oh, that's great. So it sounds like we might even be seeing a paper soon.
Absolutely.
These results.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, to end off, I'd love to ask you a slightly different question, because during the filming of Infinite Potential, you interviewed all kinds of incredible people, eminent physicists, artists, great meditators, yogis, including the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I wonder if you could just share personally any insights that you had from speaking with some of these great minds as you made the film.
Well, I think that the one thing, I suppose, first of all, I just felt it was a huge privilege for me to even be making this project. I mean, and I have to say, it took a long time to put the money together and to get people sufficiently interested to do it, because after being so excited, as very often, when you get a really exciting story, that has so many deep revelations to be explored, suddenly you become very deflated and you say, well, yeah, it's a great idea, but how am I going to do it and where am I going to get the money? But anyway, all of that is history now. And as you say, I met the best scientific minds. I met some great artists, Anthony Gormley. I met His Holiness the Dalai Lama. But what struck me the most was just how impressed they were by David Bohm, and how David Bohm, in a sense, transformed their lives. That was just incredible, that these people, and the other thing I say about these people, and I think one of the successes, if you like, in the film, is that 90% of the people we interviewed in the film knew David Bohm, or were colleagues of David Bohm, or had met David Bohm. So there was a certain knowing in the film that they could talk about David Bohm. There were a couple of others whose lives have been directly affected by David Bohm. They didn't know him, but they completely have embraced, if you like, his worldview, his universal view of the nature of reality and creation. But I think the Dalai Lama was quite amazing, just how, he told me about how David Bohm really grounded him in quantum physics, and also how, in a sense, the rational view of that science, the pursuit of science, is the pursuit of facts, is the pursuit of truth alone. And the Dalai Lama was telling me how when he was always very interested in science from a very early age, but that Buddha himself told his followers and his monks and so on, never accept anything out of faith, but out of your own thorough investigation and experiment and so on. And Bohm put it to the Dalai Lama, he said, if it was proven that a belief that you have is proven scientifically to be wrong, how would you respond to that? And the Dalai Lama said he'd chuck it out.
Yeah.
He just, because everything must be based it must be rationally based. Your faith, you must believe in things, not out of blind faith, or wishful thinking. It must be grounded in your own inquiry into why is this so. So I think that they had a meeting of minds there. Then you've people like well, of course, even getting to the Dalai Lama was a kind of a trial in itself. How do we actually get to him? But I think that ultimately we got to the Dalai Lama because of the relationship he had with David Bohm, and that was it. Because he had this great affection for David Bohm and what David Bohm taught him, and they cohered so much in terms of their philosophical outlook and the grounding that Bohm was able to give the Dalai Lama in science. Then you have people like Roger Penrose, who I suppose, is he just got the Nobel Prize for Physics. He's almost like regarded as today's Einsteinian kind of figure. He's there, and it was just wonderful to talk to him and the influence that David Bohm. Because himself, David Bohm, and Basil Hiley were working together at in different departments at Birkbeck at University College London, and they used to meet every week and just have these extraordinary discussions about the nature of reality. And you possibly saw that funny reference that Roger Penrose makes in the film. He said that Bohm was a bit like a wave function himself. You'd ask him a question, he'd give you a very focused answer, and then it would spread out like a wave, and he'd start bringing in spirituality and philosophy and all kinds of things. And Penrose said he got completely lost, and he'd have to ask another question, and then Bohm would go shoom, take him right back to the point, and then expand out again like a wave. Anthony Gormley, the artist, his sculptures, the way he expresses through his work the state between the implicate and the explicit. And there's that famous quantum cloud on the Thames, where depending on how you look at it, you see the possibility of the emergence of a man. In this huge sculpture on the Thames. But again, he was deeply influenced by Bohm's ideas, and very much the ideas of emergence and becoming, that we are all, in a sense, as he puts it, co-producers of a possible world. And Anthony Gormley's artistry is invested in exactly that. It is like the emergence of possibility. And he did that beautifully in the quantum cloud, where you see, is it a man? There's something emerging there, and then it's not there, and then it is there again, So you have these incredible people who were so influenced by David Bohm, and again, they just enriched, if you like, my experience in terms of making the documentary, and they really gave me the sense that I was on the right track, that I was pursuing something of great importance for the world. And then you had people like LeRoy Littlebear. I don't know if he was in the version you saw, but he was a native Blackfoot American. Bohm was, and of course, the native peoples traditionally are very much into transformation and flux and so on. And this is exactly the world that Bohm was. But Bohm was also very interested in language. He made a very famous statement once that we are suspended in language, that we have to use words to communicate. And how are we going to communicate these things that we draw on a blackboard, these formulas and so on, and translate them into normal speak, so that we can actually take these ideas to people. So Bohm became very interested, if you like, in verb-based languages. Again, you see emergence, process, continuation. Everything is a continuation, is in continuum. So verb-based language, the cat chases the mouse, but what actually happens in between. The cat is chasing the mouse. So what is this piece of magic that is happening in between? So he wanted to develop an entirely new language, which he called the Rio mode. And the word Rio mode means flowing mode. And he met this Blackfoot elder, and he was hugely impressed by the way they spoke about flux and transformation. But of course, the Blackfoot elder put it to Bohm. He said, why do you want to develop a new language? Why don't you just learn Blackfoot?
Yeah,
it's already there. Because, Blackfoot has, like, for example, if you take the word, say, for any kind of animal in Blackfoot, I'm not sure what it is. It could be something like uwakadawa or something like that, okay? And so if you talk to a Blackfoot, they will say, well, that is a dog, or it's a bird, or it's whatever. But when you go deeper, what it really means is a being of some kind in motion.
Yeah.
So again, it's the idea of motion, and it leaves for the possibility of transformation, that you can change from man to animal to all of these kind of things. And Bohm was entirely fascinated by that world. So to meet people like His Holiness, Penrose, Gormley, people like LeRoy Little Bear, and all the other great people that we encountered in that film who knew Bohm. David Shrum was another very special person, because he really was a great bridge between the hard physics and making it all relatable to the world that we actually live in. He was a great inspiration. So it was just a great experience for me. I hope that answers your question to some degree.
Oh, it answers many questions. Yeah. Thank you very much. And the things you say about language are interesting too, because it's my understanding Sanskrit is like that too, where the nouns are verbs. So when you say bird in Sanskrit, you're actually saying birding, the process of being a bird. I don't know the language, but I've heard that from other scholars.
Yeah. But actually, it's interesting you mentioned that, because, in Bohm's view, and of course in traditional native Aboriginal or native Indian views, the fish is part of the river system. The bird is part of the forest. You can't really see the fish as being separate from the river, or the bird being separate from the tree. And again, you get this sense of oneness, this sense of wholeness, that, I am connected to the bird, and I'm connected to the animal world, the trees. I saw a beautiful picture of the inside of a lung recently. And when you think, it looked like a tree, just a tree, how the inside of the lung kind of takes in air and breathes out air. That's exactly what trees do. And what we breathe out, trees breathe in. And what they breathe out, we breathe in. So there is this total interconnectivity. And it's just, the more and more I go on in life, I'm seeing all of these connections. And if you look at some of the imagery of inside the brain, it almost mirrors spiral galaxies and the outer cosmos and so on. So it's like, again, this whole idea that the whole is contained in all the parts.
Yeah.
That's really, and when you begin to realize that, I think and you not just realize it intellectually, but you feel it. You really do begin to get the sense that we really do need to take care of one another, and that we really do need to take care of the planet. And it's not just some idea, but they are ideas rooted in deep physics. And that's the beauty of David Bohm.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today to share with us that connection between, physics, the nature of reality, morality, interdependence. It's been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your time today.